Russia.
Yes. Now, at the beginning of the programme, David Bryan used the word coup, but not the only person to be using the word coup at the moment.
No, here we have it coming into the mainstream. Jeremy Clarkson, columnist in the Times, is saying we're in the midst of a coup, but who the hell's behind it, he asks. That's a good question and a good observation. So he writes, my son came over for father and son chat the other day. We laughed about what innocuous word had been banned that day and who'd been cancelled. And then after a pause, he said with a solemn face, you do know there's a war going on, don't you? And talking about a war on us, not on Ukraine. And he continued to think about what typically happens in a military operation and look at what the woke left has done here. It seized control of our television and radio stations to such an extent that last week Sophie Raworth said on the BBC News at 6 with a straight face, and now over to our LGBT and diversity correspondent. And he concluded, at least Arthur Scargill had the decency to get on a soapbox and state his aims in public. This lot don't. They sit at home, hiding in the impenetrable shadow of anonymity, inventing new rules to ensnare anyone and everyone they deem to be unworthy. Monty Python joked in the Spanish Inquisition sketch that it was a crime of heresy by thought, but today it's a reality. Now, this is a good article. There's a couple of things that aren't quite right. These people don't sit at home. They sit in Parliament, they sit in think tanks, they sit in our institutions, they sit in academia, they sit in many important places because they've had the long march through the institutions and they sit in our institutions now. But that aside, this is a sound observation that it is a war. And Mr. Clarkson, welcome to the battlefront.
Yes, indeed. And Mark, sticking with politics and so on, head over to the United States now. And Patrick a couple of weeks ago was talking about the issue of selecting a new speaker for the Congress. Now, of course, that speaker was indeed elected eventually after countless rounds of voting to try to get him in. What's the latest going on here?
Well, this is kind of about the substance of it and the range of opinions that have been put out about it. Initially, the media portrayed the selection of the new House Speaker as almost pure chaos, largely pointless, and party infighting in the Republican Party. And what we're showing on the next slide here is an article at republicbroadcasting.org, where I do a weekly radio show. And this talks about the Freedom Caucus, which is about 46 key Republicans among 222 Republicans in the U.S. House. And that's compared to 212 Democrats. That's the current balance. But the Freedom Caucus, as Wayne Root is pointing out in this RBN article, there's a point to all of this. It's not just a bunch of pointless chaos. The Freedom Caucus made McCarthy the House Speaker, and it's dependent on a number of key reforms. Now, the next slide is you might say, the left-wing view or the center-left internationalist view on this. This is from the Brookings Institution. I won't comment much on this except to go to the next one after this. And this is what the Brookings Institution has to say about it. Unlike past factions that often occupy the political center, making common cause with minority party lawmakers, far-right Freedom Caucus members, there are 46 of them, generally hail from safe red, aka conservative seats, and often vote against large bipartisan deals. Some of them spearheaded efforts to keep former President Trump in office after he lost the 2020 election, and almost all of the returning members of the House voted in the wake of the January 6th attack on the Capitol to overturn the results of the presidential election. Once again, they're trying to say the conservative congressmen who suspected election theft were trying to overturn the results when in fact they felt the election had already been overturned and they wanted to correct that. So it's a constant mischaracterization of what went on in those November elections in 2020. Moving on, in this same slide, many Freedom Caucus members demanded that Republican leaders loosen the procedural reins. That's because in recent decades, House majorities have centralized authority over the agenda in leaders' hands. So even the Brookings Institution is admitting here that with the Freedom Caucus given Kevin McCarthy conditions to be House Speaker, the Speaker himself is not going to have so much power and so much sway over the House agenda. So let's say the House wanted to try and end the Fed or do something more dramatic, it might become a little easier to do more a paradigm shifting legislation. And this is what the more conservative so-called right-wing writer William or Mr. Root had to say, Wayne Root, excuse me. And here's an intriguing perspective on the tumultuous process of Congress naming the new GOP Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, from alt-writer Wayne Allen Root. Now Trump wants to be president again. Trump never saw the House Speaker as his calling. He was flattered by my idea to be House Speaker for a change, but he never wanted the job. House Speaker takes up too much time. Trump needs to be free to run for president again. So there's this rumor that Trump is going to run again. Trump plays chess at a much higher level. My idea, Mr. Root is saying, speaking in the first person, was a good one. Trump just made it happen in a different way. You see, Trump is the newly elected House Speaker, just not in name. In name, the title goes to Kevin McCarthy. But guess who got McCarthy elected? Trump. And guess who controls McCarthy's every move as House Speaker? The MAGA, America First, loyal Trump members of the Freedom Caucus. So this might sound a little fantastic on the surface, but this is how wide-ranging the views are on the speakership of Mr. McCarthy. On the one hand, that he's just a toady for a bunch of disgruntled right-wingers. That's what the left wing says. On the far extreme, you might say to the right, they're saying that he's actually acting in Trump's stead to kind of set the table for Trump to return to run for president again in 2024. And so that just kind of provides the perspective at the widest possible range, a look at the widest possible perspective on what's going on there. But moving on here a little bit more, and look at what McCarthy got, what they got McCarthy to agree to, allowing just one member of the GOP Congress to move to vacate the Speaker's chair, meaning if McCarthy doesn't keep his word to Trump conservatives, he's out on a moment's notice. McCarthy had to agree to give 3 members of the Freedom Caucus seats on the powerful House Rules Committee, including House outspoken Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio. The new draft rules McCarthy agreed to will prevent any new increases in spending. Any legislation that increases spending will never see the light of day. Raising of the debt limit will be very difficult, or at least, somewhat more difficult. And then to summarize, McCarthy also agreed to a requirement for 72 hours before any bill comes up for a vote, meaning that members now have time to actually read a bill before voting on it. Well, we can hope so. McCarthy agreed to allow floor votes on term limits and border security. Get that? I put special emphasis on that. So term limits and border security, like I say, more dramatic changes might get more attention and be more achievable. And summarizing here, McCarthy agreed to establish a committee to investigate the weaponization of the federal government, in particular efforts by the FBI and national security agencies to influence elections in favor of Democrats and punish conservatives. And finally, McCarthy's first act as House Speaker was to repeal funding for 87,000 new IRS agents. The Senate probably won't pass that repeal, and Biden doubtly pretty much would not sign that. It's doubtful that he would sign it, that is. And so, nevertheless, it's seen as a symbolic thing. The only other thing I'll add to wind this up is the Freedom Caucus's view on Social Security, however, I would say myself, in my opinion, is somewhat wrong-headed. They're talking about trimming it way back, possibly, always speaking of Social Security as an entitlement. But I took part in a economics conference back in 2011 called Economics as If God Mattered. And E. Michael Jones, the noted Catholic author, was there. And they talked about the fact that Social Security is deferred wages. It's the wages workers put into the system, and they indeed are entitled to collect and not have them arbitrarily cut. So that's the one, you might say, flaw or potential flaw among an otherwise pretty sound Freedom Caucus agenda. So this is what McCarthy had to agree to, and this really kind of shows the whole perspective on this whole issue.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Mark. I know David wants to come back to you on that last point, but look, David, we're absolutely out of time for the main news, so we'll keep that for extra. But Brian, we're going to finish with a little bit of video if you'd like to introduce it.
Okay, thank you for that, Mike. Well, it's been wonderful to be up here north of the border, and I'd just like to say we met so many wonderful people in Glasgow, but I've been talking to people in other places as we've moved around a little bit up here. But David was kind enough before the march on Saturday to take me to a very beautiful part of Scotland, not too far north of Glasgow. But we took a little bit of video clip because we thought we would like to share the peace and serenity with our UK column viewers and listeners. So this is just a little bit of video clip that I took with my phone, but I thought it was so wonderful, we thought we'd share it as the play out for today's news. So, David, you've brought me to this spectacular location. I believe we're somewhere north of Glasgow. Tell the UK column viewers where we are.
This is beautiful Loch Katrine. This is where Glasgow's water supply comes from, and as reservoirs go, it's rather wonderful. It's entirely natural, and it was built, the Victorians built some huge pipelines to take the clean and pure water down to the big city of Glasgow, and solved the cholera outbreaks in doing so.
Okay, so it's very quiet here today, and we took a drive through some very pretty scenery and stopped at another very attractive piece of water. Several guys fishing. They were pretty tough because they were there in their camper wagons and tent and a few kayaks as well. So that's obviously the place to be.
That was Loch Venacha, and that has a few hardy pike fishermen out in the depths of winter, dedicated to the sport.
Okay,
this is a part of Scotland called the Trossachs, and it's very pretty.
Okay, and we're on our way down to Glasgow for this freedom gathering today. So, how do you think it'll be?
I really don't know. It's starting in Glasgow Green, and I actually don't know what to expect. This has been during the whole lockdown, during the jockdown, during all the oppression we've been through. These hardy souls have gathered at Glasgow Green very frequently to give one another support and encouragement, and they're still going there, and they're still talking about why we need to be free and what the state's doing that's making us increasingly less free. So we're going down for a chat, we're going down to meet some good people, and I really don't know what to expect, but it should be fun.
It will be fun, and we'll take a part 2 for our audience, so stay with us.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that, Brian. David, you were waving something at me, but I couldn't quite see what it was. Is there something you want just to mention briefly? I mean, very briefly.
Well, just a reminder to anyone who's within travelling distance of Motherwell, we're meeting, UK Column is having a meet-up at Motherwell tonight, 6:30 for 7 at the Glo Centre. The speakers will include Brian Gerrish, Dr. Bruce Scott and Richard Lucas, and I'll be there, and there will be many questions from the audience, and many cups of tea will be consumed, and we'll have a really good time.
Tea? I thought you could have done better than that, but okay, we'll talk about that in extra. We'll be back for extra in a couple of minutes. Stick with us if you're a UK Column member. Otherwise, we'll see you as usual at 1 p.m. on Wednesday. Thanks for joining us. Bye bye.